All right, welcome all. So today we are going to listen to about writing clean code in X++. It's more of a theoretical session. We'll come to X++ code as well, but kind of technical stuff. So for some, it might be boring, but yeah, that's all. Starting off with myself. Ooh. Yeah, I don't want to miss this opportunity of marketing myself. So I'm Devinder Singh. I'm a technical consultant at Fed IT Group, having 10 years of experience in IT industry and 7 years in AX space. So with that, go into the agenda for today. We'll be talking about what is clean code, what is clean code, why clean code is important, how to write clean code, and code patterns in X++. So first of all, let's start with what is clean code. Everyone can have their own definition of what makes for a clean code, but the widely known definition is a code that is easy to understand and easy to change is considered as a clean code. So whenever, so how do you know that it is easy to understand and easy to change? So the best example is when you send it for a code review and the number of WTF you will receive will give you an idea of how that particular code was to the different user. It's similar to a humor. If you have to explain it, it means that it's a bad code. Now, why is clean code important? So when you write clean code, it's easily maintainable and it's easy to extend. The second person, like you are not working alone when you are working on ERP or larger projects. So if the other person is not able to understand or maintain that code, it's not that great. It adds to your cost. Secondly, whatever code you have written, it should be easy to debug and refactor. It should follow some of the standards and basic best practices. And one of the figures, if you can see on the right hand side, like if you have written your code in a clean way, then you are improving your reading and then reducing the overall effort required to maintain or extend that particular piece of code. Long story short, clean code is important and worth your time. Even if it takes longer time to write the clean code, it will make up for it when in the longer duration or the longer run. So it all boils down to quality, similar to why you buy some stuff or some brand of shoes or clothing. It's similar to that one. Like you want quality out of whatever you're getting or writing. Now, the question comes, how do you make sure that you are writing a clean code? These are some of the things like noted down irrespective of which language you are writing your code. If you want to know more about all of these, like then there is a very nice book written by Uncle Bob. So you need to go through that, how to write clean code. We'll shortly go through each and every one, but not in full detail. Like first of all, we'll talk about meaningful names. That whenever you are writing up, you're creating a new variable or new class, the name should have some meaningful reference to what you need to have in that particular class or what that particular piece of variable is going to do or held. Comments, the only truly good comment is when you don't have to write one. If you have to write one, that should only explain the behavior and not about a particular line or no additional comments or username who has written that particular piece of code. You don't have to write any such things. Formatting is like whenever formatting is important. It helps in reducing the reading time of another person and overall good experience in understanding what the particular piece of code is doing. When you talk about error handlings, you need to use exceptions rather than returning error codes, and so use the newly created exceptions in D365 as well as the finally keyword if you have not used it, or if you are migrating from X 2012, you need to use that wisely to improve your clean code. There are other factors, boundaries, unit tests. Unit tests should follow your first principle, like it should be independent, it should be repeatable, it should run in a timely manner. Then consistency, like whatever names you're writing or whatever class name you're giving, you should have consistency in namings or writing methods. An example would be if there is a particular method like find method, then all the tables which you are writing, then if you're writing a name as find, they should be consistent in their behavior, that they are doing the same stuff, and you're not writing find and get doing the same stuff with the different names. And clutter is like you're not leaving unused variables, or you're not leaving commented code that somebody else might be using that particular commented code. Yeah, you should all clean up all those things. You should follow on the standard conventions and basic best practices. Whenever you are writing or particular piece of code, you need to understand the algorithm behind it before fiddling it up so that your solution looks good. I'm not going through detail of each and every point because we all have been into this space and have, I think, more than enough experience to follow all these things. We'll jump to the main point, right? Like writing clean code in X++. When we want to write a clean code in X++, the main thing I can think of is like we need to follow the principles and the code patterns. We'll talk about code patterns in a short while, but let's start with the principles. So one of the foremost principle is our solid principle and a dry principle. So solid means your code is having or your particular method or classes are having single responsibility. They are not doing multiple things. Let me share the code so that we can relate back to all these principles. So when I talk about this is purge line table, and so any of these methods, they are doing a single thing at the moment. Like an example would be calculate line discount, calculate line discount unit. So it's doing it's only calculating the line discount. It's not doing anything else. It's not getting any another. It's not returning purge quantity, or it's not playing around with any other logic or calculating the discount or anything else. It's just doing what your method wants to do. No major things, like no other conditions or anything else. It's simply returning calculate line discount unit. That's your first principle, that you don't write anything major except for what you intend to do. It should not do multiple things at the moment. Then second of solid principle is open close, that whenever you are writing a particular piece of code, you make sure that you intend for that piece of code to be extended and it need not to be modified. An example would be the same. Like if you go around the calculate line discount method, even though this method is public, but they don't want it to be extended. And that's why they have attributed, added the attributes as hookable as false and wrappable as false as well. So if you want an extension on that particular piece of method or class, then only you need to allow the extensions. If there is no need to allow any extensions on that particular piece of code, just don't give a extension point for that method or class. Third principle in solid is your list of substitution. What that means is that um, your your child class is able to substitute your base class wherever it is being referenced. We'll talk more about it and when we are going through patterns, code patterns. The fourth principle in solid is your interface segregation. What that means is when you're creating your interfaces, and if you have like a particular interface should only have one single responsibility inside that as well. Like you don't want your interface to have multiple things and then ended up like whatever classes or anything, if they want to inherit that particular interface, the, they are not bound to implement another method which they don't want to. An example is this, like this particular interface, you are just referring one particular method and you are not writing any other method, right? If you write any other method, all the classes that are referring to this particular interface need to implement that method as well, and which might lead to complications when some of the classes don't want to implement that method. Our fourth principle is your dependency inversion. It means that when you are dealing with when you are dealing with the instances, or when you are working with the some of the parameters, then you need to use abstractions instead of concrete variables. That helps in replacing whatever the current logic is, and you don't need to replace at multiple places. One of the nice example is this same rec plan data source. So when we are passing a parameter here, it's passed as a interface variable and not as a concrete table. So if you want later on, wherever this method is being used, like if I go and find the references. So here you are passing processor as table filler, but let's suppose later on you want to modify and pass on something else. You just need to create another uh, class or anything else which that will be implementing your interface. So you don't need to do anything, any modification on your original code or interface. You just need to pass or change the calling logic and nothing else. That's our solid principles. Any questions so far in solid principles?
No, I think you can continue, Dave.
Thanks, Rachit. Then second principle is try principle. It's relatively easy to understand. The only basic thing it wants is that you should not write or repeat your code. Whenever you are repeating your code, that means you are opening up multiple places for extensions, and you need to test multiple pieces of code, and then it all adds up to the cost of migrating, extending things. After code principles, it's patterns. So what are patterns? Patterns are just the templates of how to solve a problem that can be used in different situations. It helps us in uh, it helps us in avoiding some of the basic pitfalls with writing a newly different functionality. That if you are following a particular piece of pattern, then inherently you are following some of the best practices that have been implemented or have been researched from last couple of years. It also defines a common language that your the teammate or you can understand or communicate more efficiently. If you want to know more about the patterns or how many patterns are available, I think there is a good book from Gang of Four, that is Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software. I think yeah, you should take a good look at all the patterns available. From D365 perspective, I'll let's start with the singleton pattern. Now, singleton pattern is used to limit creation of a class to only one object. It's mainly used to save a particular state or particular information for for within the given session. So the example of this it would be auto charge setup by site and warehouse feature. Right, you are creating a static variable here, and you are basically checking if that static variable has been used earlier or has been assigned a value earlier or not. And if it is not uh, initialized, you are just creating that singleton variable and then using that across the session. Now, why I've included this, it's very basic principle and everyone I know about it. But the difference is that in AX 2012, we used to implement this singleton pattern using global cache, sys global cache classes. You used to save that in global cache and then retrieve values from the global cache. But in D365, you no longer need to do that. And this static variable will help you in achieving your goal of creating a singleton or saving a state. Now, one thing you need to know or note about it is that this is scoped by this session. That is, two different sessions will not share the static member. So you just note that whenever you are trying to implement the singleton pattern here. This another pattern that is widely used in D365 is factory method. It's a design pattern which helps or defines an interface for creating an object that but your classes will decide on which particular class will need to be initialized or instantiate, like which child class needs to be created in this particular example or in this particular piece of code. Now, factory methods can be there are two main frameworks in D365 which use factory design pattern, that is Sys extension framework and your Sys plugin extension. Now, how do you identify which of these extensions needs to be used or which framework need to be used whenever you're trying to implement something from factory patterns? Then you need to go and review your construct method. The construct method will help you out in deciding that which framework are you using. If we go with the Sys extension framework, like Sys extension framework is, as talked about earlier, that it's a type of factory design pattern. The attributes will help us in deciding that which base class needs to be instantiated in a particular example. Let's review the code and then see how this sys extension framework is utilized in AX. So if you go and check purge line copy from source and review your construct method as I was talking about earlier, that your construct method will help you in deciding about which particular extension method or the base class or subclasses will be used or instantiated in this particular example. So whenever you go and check the construct method of your base class, there is no reference to your subclasses or child classes here. And how you instantiate or create a new variable is by checking the attribute. Like in this example, we are checking the table ID, and then based on the table ID, we put we get the attribute, and from that attribute we try and get the class name. So if I go and check all the references of that attribute, your forecast sales has the same attribute, and it tells you that which particular table will be used for that attribute or temp virtual temp form virtual
Sorry, can you
table.
zoom in a bit? Wait.
Oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
just to interrupt. Just zoom the code so that it's
Yeah.
readable. Thank you.
Yep. So I hope it's visible now.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So whenever you're trying, this is a base class. It's an abstract class, right? And your all the child classes that are extending from this particular piece of class, they need to implement a attribute, and that attribute specifies which table will be used or which enum str will be used. It can be anything. It's just the name of the attribute. And then based on that attribute value, we need to instantiate this particular class. So if we go to the purge line copy from source, it picks up the attribute for from the class. And then based on the attribute, it knows that it needs to instantiate the purge line forecast sales variable. And then once you have the variable available, then you are calling the initialize method of the corresponding class. That's for the sys extension framework. Now we'll move on to the other framework, that is your sys plugin framework. Now sys plugin framework is an extension based on managed extension framework, which basically allows you to create extendable solution for a known X++ code as well. If you're not familiar with it much, it's heavily used in retail POS solutions and X2012 as well. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll talk about why we use SysPlugin in D365. You might have come across some situations where your one of the base classes exist in uh, the one model, and your extendable class or your subclasses or your child classes are existing in second model. With in this case, plugin or sys plugin will help you in breaking dependency between different models. Like you can't access your child class in your base class module. So in those cases, it definitely helps us in getting the right uh, approach for writing extendable solution. So let's take an example from the code. So it's the dimension validation request class. So if you review this class, um, the main class exists in dimensions model, and all of your child classes are existing in different modules. Like one is in application suite and another is in application suite, and this one exists in a ledger module. Now if we go and review the dimension validation request, you notice this attribute which helps in defining that this particular class is using your sys plugin framework. Like you are exporting all the interface attributes, and then when you check how it's being initialized, yep, so it's this particular piece of code which helps in getting its the name for child class that needs to be instantiated here. Um, look at the child class first, and we'll come back to that particular piece of code. Here, check the attribute mentioned on the class itself. Like it tells which or what value in, like if it is a ledger dimension type, then this particular class will be instantiated from that base class. And if it is an of account type, then this particular class will be instantiated. Um, so dimension value, if you say new for ledger dimension type, when you're calling the metadata collections and passing on the type of ledger dimension type, based on this, you're collecting the metadata and passing on that metadata when you are creating the instance of that class. And this is how the base class know that I need to create an instance of ledger dimension validation request. Any questions till this point in Sys plugin or Sys extension frameworks?
Uh, Hi Devinder, Pradeep here.
Hey,
Could you
Pradeep.
please go back to the AOT for
Mm-hmm.
this dimension?
Yep.
So, you mean to say ledger and dimensions don't have a reference to the base class or
So
application
no,
suite?
so what I mean to say is dimension or the base class should never have a or knowledge about the subclasses. That's one of the basic principles why we have introduced this frameworks. That whenever you are building your own model, it never know about any new models that will be coming up on top of that, right? So in that
Mhm.
case, it will never know about any new classes that can be built on top of this. So that's why your base class, that is your dimension validation request, does not have any information about any of these classes like ledger dimension validation request or budget dimension validation request. So in this case, we
No,
use
my
SysPlugin.
my question is, if ledger is have a reference to dimension, just
Yes.
an example,
Yeah.
they can still use it, right? They
Yeah.
can, yeah.
Ledger class will be still be able to use it, but let's take another approach to this one. So you need, if ledger can use the dimension validation request, if you need to write this method, you need to write this method inside the ledger dimension so that it can create that variable, right? But what about budget dimension? You need to rewrite that same code in budget dimension, or you need to rewrite the same code in any other class, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in those cases, you will never be able to write it down. And second thing is, if you write it down in these particular classes, and if you want to extend this logic, you need to write extension on ledger dimension as well as on budget dimension and on budget dimension validation request. So it violates our dry principle that we don't want to repeat our code.
Thanks, Devinder.
Yeah. Thank you, Pradeep. Let's move on to another pattern. Like that's new pattern introduced in D365 again. That is observer pattern. Yeah. So observer pattern is used when we need, when if there is anything modified or anything changed, and we want to notify all the dependent objects that something has happened on our end. You do whatever you want to do. And real life example would be like when you want to know when a new iPhone 12 is coming down, then you can subscribe to JB Hi-Fi subscription or anything, and then let them know that whenever there is some a new variant coming or new phone is coming, you just email me. It's similar to that one. The most common example of that is your display methods in forms. Whenever a variable has a change because of something change in variable, we want to um, refresh the display method on that particular form so that UI looks clean and good without any changes or any specific code calling. We'll share screen for code again to review these things. If you go to sales table form, good. So there is a particular variable. Okay, so we'll start with this display method. So there is a display method created to um, display if sales order is a retail order or not. This display method, generally whenever you open up a form, display methods are automatically called up. But when or if there is any change to that particular variable, how do you make sure that your UI gets refreshed automatically? You don't need to write a specific code. What you just need to do is specify a particular attribute on that variable, and that attribute is your form observable attribute. Whenever AX AX know about this form observable attribute, whenever there is a change on is retail variable, it automatically refreshes the UI and to reflect the latest values. So an example is, this particular piece of code is changing the value of is retail order, or so whenever this gets changed or assigned a value, it automatically refresh your display methods. There is no specific refresh or any other code that needs to be called to change the UI. This same thing, same variable or attribute you can assign on any class variables as well, and that will reflect down in your code, like in if any of the display methods, if you're referencing a class and then that class has variables which is having form observable, then also it picks it up and refreshes automatically. Second thing for display methods might be that whenever uh, something changes on data source, then also you want to refresh your display method or calculate the values again. An example of that would be your return replace. So that's so if there is so this particular form is like it's a header and lines form. Like if you have a display method on header level, which depends like quantity to allocate or quantity allocated depends on your line details, then you can write a form observable or observer pattern on line level, which will observe all the line changes, and then based on any of the changes, it will automatically call all the display methods. So if you want to do that, what you need to write is observe or with the your data source, like this particular data source. If it has any changes, AX will keep on observing this. If there is any particular piece of change in that data source, it will automatically call this display method. Last one of the observable pattern example is your event-based changes. Like you can think of any classes or any event that happens, and then you need to refresh your UI. An example of that would be your purge table forms. Now, so the observer can observe any actions that is happening in the background, and then you need to, based on the action, you need to identify and refresh your display methods. So in this case, we use different approach than the earlier ones. In the case like we have a new keyword form observable link, and using this link, we need to refresh our display methods. So an example is that whenever you say that this link has been changed, or it's similar to when you notify this form that I have done, or the event is done, then you need to mark it that this particular thing has been changed. Now, if you see this particular method is being called from another drop dialog. Whenever we are finished with the drop dialog, it calls this refresh workflow icon. And when this is called, it basically says that, okay, I have been marked, or whatever event has occurred. It basically says that I have changed. So you are notified to observe this change. You see, so wherever you are adding this links.observe, all those display method will be refreshed automatically with this. So mark changed will be used to just see if there is any changes on that, or the action will notify that I have changed. And when action has notified and form receives this value, it basically calls all the methods or display methods that have been observing uh, this variable. Any questions so far on form observable patterns?
No, Davinder,
Yep.
don't see any questions as of now.
Yep.
Great going.
Thank you. Like there are so many things which we can do. Like it's very short duration. I can't go into too much detail of each and everything, but there are some more things we can look into D365 that have been changed from X2012 and really helps in writing a clean code. That are your decorator patterns, which are heavily used in your COC or chain of command. Your finally keyword, as we talked about earlier, that any solution that has been migrated from AX2012 that is doing error handling, we have not written down finally keyword. You can write it down and then move your logic into that. That makes things a bit of clean. Sysda for extending your queries. In operator, it's very useful when you are searching for things, especially for enums. And there have been new exception types that have been added and can be used to clean up your some of the earlier hookups or things you have to implement to cope up with not having the enough exception types. The I mean, it might take some time to understand all the patterns and to implement that in your daily life if you're not already doing it. But you just need to remember that if the guy who ends up maintaining your code will be a violent psychopath and who knows your address, then it might be troublesome for you. That's it from my side. Any questions? Anything?
Excellent session, Davinder. You said it will be a boring, but I don't think so. I myself have learned a lot, which I didn't know, seriously, honestly. So it's a very, very
Likewise.
deep, insightful, very, very good session. We
Thank you, Faisal.
definitely we definitely need more sessions of this type so that we can help and explain people and learn at the same time, because as I also learned about this new observer methods, I didn't know that one previously. That's really good.
Yeah, thanks, Faisal. Thanks everyone for joining. If
Yeah,
you don't
great
have any
session. Yeah.
questions now, you can just email me or contact me on my LinkedIn profile.
Excellent. With this one, we will wrap it up. if we don't have any further questions. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the speakers. Uh, their email address is, I think so, the Devinder has shared email address. We All the recordings will be available